Before we begin this week's episode, I would like to invite you to become a Patreon member. You can do this by heading over to Patreon at patreon.com/The Violin Chronicles and signing up. Here you'll be able to access all the episodes plus bonus episodes for Patreon members only. The first one I am publishing is about the incredible Queen's Ballet held at the French court in which Amati's violins played and the amazing story surrounding it. And it's important because it was the first occasion where written music specifically for violin was made. For Patreon members, I will also be publishing short episodes, piccolo episodes on each maker. They will only go for half an hour. The first one is on Gasparo da Salo, where we'll be talking briefly about the Brescian makers that came even before him, then briefly about his life, and then the characteristics of a Gasparo or Brescian instrument, if you'd like to be able to identify different aspects or be reminded of characteristic points. Head on over to Patreon for that. Now back to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the Violin Chronicles, a podcast in which I, Linda Lespe, will attempt to bring to life the story surrounding famous, infamous, or just not very well known, but interesting violin makers of history. I'm a violin maker and restorer. I graduated from the French Violin Making School some years ago now, and I currently live and work in Sydney with my husband Antoine, who is also a violin maker and graduate of the French school, l'École Nationale de Lutherie in Mirecourt. As well as being a luthier, I've always been intrigued with the history of instruments I work with, and in particular, the lives of those who made them. So often when we look back at history, I know that I have a tendency to look at just one aspect, but here my aim is to join up the puzzle pieces and have a look at an altogether fascinating picture. So join me as I wade through tales not only of fame, famine and war, but also of love, artistic genius, revolutionary craftsmanship, determination, cunning and bravery that all have their part to play in the history of the violin. Welcome back to Cremona, a city where you can find almost anything your everyday Renaissance citizen could desire. Located on a bend of the impressively long Po River, bursting with artisans and commerce, we find ourselves in the mid-1500s, and more precisely in the home of Girolamo and Antonio Amati, otherwise known as the Amati Brothers. In these episodes, I'll be talking about Andrea Amati's two sons, Antonio and Girolamo. Sometimes Girolamo is also referred to as Hieronymus, the Latin version of his name. Because I'm doing these podcasts chronologically, we heard about the early childhood of the brothers in the Andrea Amati episodes. As we heard in the previous episode, Antonio, the elder brother, by quite some years, perhaps even 14 years older than Girolamo, inherited his father's workshop with his little bro when their father died. They grew up in Cremona during the mid-1500s in a time that was relatively more peaceful than their father's childhood and would have attended the local school. The local school was attended mainly by children of merchants and nobles. They would learn, in addition to the traditional subjects of geometry, arithmetic, and even astrology, subjects such as geography, architecture, algebra, and mechanics, both theoretical and applied. This created quite a well-educated middle class that the brothers would have been part of. Like their father, they would go on to be quite successful in their business, adapting their products to the demands of the time. The brothers were growing up in post-Reformation Cremona, and the instrumental music was bounding forward. Renaissance composers were fitting words and music together in an increasingly dramatic fashion. Humanists were studying the ancient Greek treatises on music and the relationships between music and poetry and how it could stir the listener's emotions. This was displayed in madrigals and later in opera. And all the while, the Amati workshop, along with other instrument makers, of course, were toiling away making instruments so that all this could happen. Now, the eldest brother, Antonio, never appears to marry or have a family, but the younger brother, Girolamo, apparently a ladies' man, does. And as you would have heard in the previous episodes, when he was 23, he married Lucrezia Cronetti, a local girl, and she comes to live in the Amati house, handing over her dowry to her new husband and father-in-law. A few years later, Girolamo's father saved up enough money to buy the family home so that when he passes away in 1577, Girolamo is in his mid-20s and his older brother in probably around his late 30s. They inherited a wealthy business, a house and a workshop. So here we find the Amati brothers living and working together in the house and workshop in San Faustino. Antonio, the head of the household, and Girolamo with his young bride. Business is looking good and life looks promising. Antonio and Girolamo may have been one of the only violin makers in Cremona, but they were by far not lone artisans in the city. They were surrounded by merchants and tradespeople busy in industry. There were belt makers, embroiderers, blacksmiths, carpenters, boat builders, masons, terracotta artisans, weavers, textile merchants, and printers, just to name a few of the 400 trades listed in the city at this period. Business was going well for our violin makers. There was a boom in the city. Many noble houses were being built, amongst which the grand residences of merchants stood out, sanctioning their social ascent. Charitable houses, monasteries and convents were popping up like mushrooms around town. Ever since the Counter-Reformation, the local impetus to help the poor and unfortunate had flourished. Wondering what the Counter-Reformation is? Then go back and listen to episode 2 of the Andrea Amati series, where we talk about what the Reformation was, what the Counter-Reformation was, and what its effects were on artisans in Cremona. But nowhere said organised religion like the cathedral. And entering the vast, echoey structure was something to behold, with its mysterious, awe-inspiring grandeur, the towering heights of the ceilings inspiring a sense of reverence and humility. The vaulted arches and frescoed domes drawing the eye upwards, the kaleidoscope of colours entering the windows, and the glittering of precious metals illuminated by flickering candles. Ornate furnishings, intricate artworks, sculptures, and bas-reliefs with depictions of saints, biblical stories, and the scenes from the life of Christ, covering the walls, all created an otherworldly feeling and a sense of the divine. And what would the cathedral be without music? The glittering of gold, the fragrant smell of incense, and the heavenly sounds of music were an all-in-one package for the regular church attender in the Amati Brothers' day. The Chapel House School of the Cathedral produced many talented composers, yet the church would only sponsor and permit sacred music, and even then, this music had to be in full compliance with the Council of Trent. This meant following a whole bunch of rules in composition. Wing-clipping of aspiring young composers led to many of them moving away to other courts and cities who were looking for fresh, raw talent. This may or may not have been the case for a musician and composer called Claudio Monteverdi. But what we do know is that he left Cremona to join the employ of the Mantuan court at the age of 23. I spoke to cellist James Beck about Monteverdi, who was a Cremonese composer who left the city to work at the Gonzaga court during the Amati brothers' lifetime. And so Monteverdi, for example, to take him as an example, he was employed in the court, in the Mantuan court, and he was just one of many musicians and composers. And also I'm wondering about just the everyday life. Would they also, were musicians expected to wear certain clothes? Like they were just told, look, this is what you're wearing?
Yeah, livery is the term for the uniform of the house, and we know about that kind of stuff from Downton Abbey and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, musicians were very much part of the servant class, a very intellectual servant class and a very trusted servant class. And yeah, but Monteverdi arrived at that Gonzaga court in Mantua as a string instrument player of some kind. We don't really know if it was a gamba, between the legs, or braccio, held like a violin. He was at the court for about, I think, 10 or 15 years as a string player before he became the maestro de capelle and And over the course of that was a very trusted employee because he accompanied his employer, the Duke, on various war campaigns or social outings to different to other countries.
As a musician?
As a musician and maybe as some kind of trusted...
Part of his entourage?
Yeah, part of the entourage. So Monteverdi was picking up lots of ideas about things that could go on in music. So because he was witnessing different practices. So he was in Flanders, he was in Hungary, he was in other parts of Italy, seeing how they did music over there on the other side of the fence. And I think what can never be underestimated is that communication was haphazard and accidental in previous times, and there was no such thing as uniformity. So to go to another country and to go to another court and to see musicians who had different training or had come into different spheres of influence to yourself would have been hugely, hugely exciting and influential. And we think that Monteverdi picked up some of the ideas of what might be opera from these kind of trips.
Yeah. As it makes me think of when I was a student and I would do work experience in different workshops, and I had been taught in the French school, like it was a very specific way of doing things. And I'd go to another workshop and I'd just be like, wow, it's like, what are you doing? how could this possibly work? And it does. And you're like, oh, and now I feel like the way I work, it's a mixture of all these different techniques, what works best for me. And it must have been magnified so much to such a greater level in that period for music and competition.
Because of the social isolation and the geographic isolation of previous times. And I mean, if we talk about pitch, the whole idea of what is an A was different in each town.
Yeah, and it might have sounded better on some instruments than not so good on others.
Yeah, and those instruments would have been, crafted to sound good at those different pitches, and now we all play the same pitch and we want every instrument to be the same.
Yeah.
What were some of if you could generalise, what were some of the differences for you in the different luthier schools?
So in the French method, you basically hold everything in your hands, or it's like wedged between you and the workbench, and you don't use really vices. And I have quite small hands, and I did one work experience and the guy was like, just put it in a vice. Like, why are you trying to hold this? It's too big for you. And I was like, oh, wow, yeah. And I was getting a lot of RSI and like sore wrists, and it kind of it was sort of practical as well. It was pretty.
Wow. And is that for crafting individual elements, or is that for working on complete instruments?
Yeah, like in general, like you just, you cannot make a violin you can make a violin without using a vice, and they won't use sandpaper, or it's all done with scrapers and just
wow.
So it's good. I know all the different techniques.
Yeah.
And I can, when there is a blackout or an electricity failure, we can just keep on going. Like we can keep rolling. It doesn't stop us. There was a thing with Monteverdi that you seem to know about, how madrigals with the just when I said madrigal.
I know about madrigals. I hope I do.
In Mantua and this kind of trapezoidal room.
Oh well, they did have there's a very special room in the ducal court, ducal castle or ducal palace in Mantua, and they call it the wedding room, and it's a room that had existed for some time. I mean, it's a huge palace. I think it's the 6th largest palace in Europe. So it's 34,000 square meters, 500 rooms. And this is not, Mantua was not a big state. But
you never know when you need 500 rooms.
It wasn't a big state, but it was a very aspirational state, and they really wanted to kind of prove themselves amongst the cultural elite of northern Italy, because there were extraordinary things going on in Florence and Venice. So, they were really, the Gonzagas were really trying to hold their own. So they had one of these 500 rooms slightly remodeled, so it was of cube proportions.
Right, so you walk into a cube.
You walk into a cube, and then they commissioned a very distinguished painter to cover everything within that room in very realistic, lifelike portraits of the Gonzagas going about their life. And this was the highest status room in the palace, and it was used for various purposes to impress. So it could be used for ceremonies, or it could be used for as a bedchamber for the Duke, if he wanted to receive a guest of high status and show that guest that he slept in this incredible room.
Slightly creepy. All these people looking at you.
I know, and there's a lot of eyeballing in those portraits. So
it's like you're outnumbered.
Yeah.
Like when you go in there, like you're surrounded by Gonzagas.
You're surrounded by the Gonzagas.
Yeah. Like, we're here.
Yeah. That was not a very fertile or healthy line, so they were dying out fast, but there were lots of them painted on the walls.
Wasn't there one with mirrors?
Oh, there was a hidden room that they discovered in I think 1998.
Yeah, which had mirrors, and I was wondering what maybe it was polished metal. The mirrors, I'm not sure. Where they would sing madrigals.
Well, they think it was specifically for performances of Monteverdi, but I don't know
why a hidden room is needed.
Yes, and how do you hide a room for 200 years?
Maybe it was walled up. Or they said it was above his bedchamber, so level up. Well, I mean, if you're in a palace with 500 rooms, you might miss one, if it's walled up.
And also there were quite a lot of traumatic experiences in the Mantuan court. Not long after Monteverdi left there, there was a siege and a war, and then a lot of plague. So you can see how knowledge could dissipate and
everyone could die that knew about it.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely, yeah. When the Gonzagas were running out of heirs, their neighbours, and particularly the Habsburgs, were like, we might take that little gem of a duchy. So they laid siege to it for 2 summers. War was a summer sport at those days because no one wanted to do it in winter because it was just too much. And Mantua is, at that stage, completely surrounded by water. It was very cleverly conceived and beautifully conceived too, because the water reflects the beautiful buildings. And so the Mantuans stockpiled food and drew up the bridges. And for 2 years no one came in or out of the city whilst the Habsburgs laid siege. And actually the Habsburgs didn't really get through those defences, but in the second summer, in the second siege, a cannonball did get through, and then the cannonball made some rats got through, and those dirty soldiers who'd been on campaign for 2 summers were riddled with plague, and the plague got into the town, and that was actually the undoing of the Gonzaga dynasty.
Wow. A rat brought them down.
A rat brought them down, yeah. And so the plague weakened the city fell, and then that plague was taken by those refugees from Mantua down into Venice, and Venice was absolutely devastated by plague for something like 10 years.
Oh, yeah.
And the city's population plummeted to its lowest in 150 years.
Wow. Yeah, and it's true that war was a summer sport, and I'm wondering if nowadays we play sport instead.
Well, I think that's why we do play organised sport. I think that's it's
like the World Cup. I'm thinking of the
Well, yeah.
Although that's not
to get that aggression, to get all that aggression out of our system in a nicely controlled manner.
It is like countries against each other.
It totally is.
The Cremona City municipality had at its disposal a group of wind players, mostly made up of brass instruments, trombones, bombards, bagpipes, and sometimes a cornet. This ensemble was particularly suited for outdoor performances. Or at least I hope it was. I don't know if you've ever heard a bombard being played inside. I have. Anyway, the viola da braccia players and viola or violin players were also employed by the town hall and given a uniform made of red and white cloth. This was the instrumental group in the church, and it doubled up for civic occasions as well. I speak to Carlo Chiesa, violin maker and expert in Milan.
The other way by which Cremonese makers got their success is musicians, because in the 16th century there are a few important Cremonese musicians moving from Cremona and going to northern cities to play for the emperor, for the king, or to Venice. I think the most important supplier of instruments at some point out of Cremona was the Monteverdi Circle.
This orchestra employed by the city of Cremona played both for the council and in the church on all public holidays and in processions. One of their members, a cornet player called Ariodante Reggiani, who was paid the considerable sum of 100 lire when the maestro di capella was paid 124 lire, ended up having to be let go. It turned out he was a little bit laissez-faire with his responsibilities as a musician, and a lawsuit was brought against him for neglecting his duties as a musician. To add to this, he was also found guilty of murder. So, in the end, their homicidal cornet player was replaced. James Beck. You know, you've got the scientists and human thought and philosophy and looking back to Greek and Roman antiquity. So I feel like that's like the idea in art, in literature. And how do you see that happening in music?
We as musicians had really practical roles to fulfill as well. And sometimes that was expressing the will of the church through music. And of course, you know, that's kind of self-explanatory. And then we've got this really practical role to entertain. And how we go about doing that with the materials we have. So the Renaissance as an idealistic expression, I think, you know, as a practical musician, we were always doing others' bidding out, unless we were a church musician.
Right.
We were there to entertain and to excite and to distract and to as an instrument of sometimes of state policy or of, you know, kind of showing off the power or opulence of a state.
Maybe it was through like opera where you're getting like human emotion.
Yes, absolutely. But also those the subject of all those early operas is usually ancient material from ancient Greece or Rome. So, you know, clearly Renaissance in its ideals of looking back.
Othello.
Of course, Popea. Ulysses. I mean, the operas were definitely drawing into ancient literature and myth, which was bypassing Christianity in many ways.
Yeah, it's strange because it sort of, it was an era where it didn't really contradict people were cool with it. Like they were very devoted churchgoers, and at the same time they were very into all this Greek and Roman mythology. It's interesting, and then all this human thinking and invention.
Yeah. I mean, Monteverdi was a priest as well.
Right.
Towards the end of his life.
Mm-hmm. Did a Johnny Cash. Instruments are starting to play a bigger role in the music in the church in Cremona. In 1573, the maestro di capella, the chapel master, at the cathedral wrote a piece of music for 5 voices consorted with all sorts of musical instruments. The words and text are completely clear in accordance with the Council of Trent, he points out. The Amati brothers' father, Andrea Amati, would have witnessed this musical tradition in his lifetime, as he attended church, where the music sung would have gone from something that had been unrecognisable in any case very difficult to understand, to music that had identifiable text that could possibly be understood and sung with. They were not hymns like the Lutherans were singing in a congregational style, but there was a marked change in the music being played in the churches, and these were the effects of the Counter-Reformation trickling into everyday life of the people. The workshop continued to be a success. Both the brothers were able to earn a living and to provide a generous dowry for their sister, who had just recently married a man from Castelmaggiore. In town, the cathedral looked like it was finally going to have the interior finished. This had been going on ever since their father was a little boy, and now it looked like all the frescoes and paintings were to be completed, and most amazing of all was an enormous astronomical clock that was being mounted on the terrazzo, the giant bell tower next to the cathedral. Sadly, Girolamo's pregnant wife would never see the clock that would amaze the citizens of Cremona, as shortly after giving birth to their daughter Elizabeth, Lucrezia died. The fragility of life and uncertainty that Girolamo had to deal with is quite removed from our lives today, and a man in his situation would certainly be looking to marry again, if for nothing else than to have a mother for his young daughter. And as he was contemplating remarrying, finding a new wife and mother for his child, over in Paris, one of the biggest celebrity weddings of the decade was taking place, and the music for the closing spectacle was being played in part on the instruments his father and brother had made for the Valois royal family all those years ago. And if you think Catherine de' Medici's magnificences up to now were impressive, just wait until you hear about what was probably the most expensive ballet ever performed. For that episode, I invite you to sign up to Patreon. This is the end of the first episode on the Amati Brothers, and we can see that they're starting to make their way in their careers and their lives in Cremona without their father. So join me next week as we see the drama unfold between the two brothers and the famous fight. A big thank you to James Beck for speaking to me this week. Be sure to subscribe to the Violin Chronicles so you know when new episodes are coming out, and you can leave a comment. You can follow us on Instagram with the tag at the Violin Chronicles. This is where I put a lot of images relating to the podcast. You can also email at theviolinchronicles@gmail.com. And for extra content, including the Queen's Ballet episode and the mini episodes where I sum up each maker and their life, work, and characteristics so you can work on your expertise skills, sign up to Patreon at patreon.com/The Violin Chronicles. These shorter episodes are a little bit different to what you have heard on the Violin Chronicles, and they only go for half an hour, keeping it short and sweet. And I'll catch you next time on the Violin Chronicles.